London, 1815. They say that scandal travels faster than truth in the drawing rooms of London society, that shame, once attached to a woman's name, becomes her permanent companion. I, Eleanor Hartley, never imagined that walking into a ballroom alone would place me at the center of the most talked-about romance of the season. That a single moment of defiance would lead to the most unlikely of courtships. That the very society that mocked me would soon watch in stunned silence as I became the chosen bride of its most eligible bachelor. But what I really didn't know is that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the courage to stand alone. This is the story of a woman who dared to defy convention and found a love that defied all expectations. But before we dive into this story that challenged the very foundations of Regency society, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching me? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. The truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are moments in one's life that serve as dividing lines, clear demarcations between who you were and who you are forced to become. For me, that moment arrived on a mild April evening in 1815, when I made the singularly foolish decision to attend the Ashworth ball unaccompanied. I should explain that I was not, by any stretch of imagination, a stranger to society's cruelty. As the youngest daughter of a baronet whose modest estate in Somerset barely sustained our family's genteel poverty, I had long understood my place in London's rigid social hierarchy. I was tolerated at best, pitied at worst, and generally regarded as one of those unfortunate young women who haunted the edges of ballrooms season after season, growing progressively more invisible with each passing year. At 23, I was decidedly on the shelf, a phrase I had heard whispered behind gloved hands more times than I cared to count. My dowry was laughable, a mere £2,000 that would scarcely keep a fashionable lady in bonnets for a year. My appearance was what charitable souls called distinctive, dark auburn hair that refused to curl properly, freckles that no amount of lemon juice could fade, and a figure that was neither fashionably willowy nor admirably curvaceous, but rather decidedly average in every conceivable way. But my greatest failing, the one that truly sealed my fate as a social pariah, was my unfortunate tendency to speak my mind. I had never mastered the art of simpering agreement that seemed to come so naturally to other young ladies. When Lord Pemberton declared that women had no capacity for understanding politics, I had foolishly cited Mary Wollstonecraft. When Lady Ashworth suggested that reading novels corrupted young minds, I had made the grave error of defending the literary merit of several popular works. These transgressions, minor as they might seem, had marked me as dangerously opinionated, a quality that was only charming in men. And so I had resigned myself to spinsterhood with what I hoped was grace, though I suspected was merely stubborn pride. I attended balls not with hope of securing a husband, but because they provided a fascinating study in human nature. There was something oddly entertaining about watching the intricate dance of courtship, the strategic positioning of ambitious mothers, the peacocking of eligible gentlemen, and the quiet desperation of young ladies competing for limited prizes. The Ashworth ball was expected to be the event of the season. Lady Ashworth, a formidable matron with connections to half the peerage, hosted only one ball per year, and receiving an invitation was considered a mark of social acceptance. I had been invited, I suspected, only because my aunt, Lady Pemberton, was a distant cousin of the family, and had likely insisted upon it. I was meant to attend with Aunt Pemberton, who served as my chaperone during my increasingly futile seasons in London. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. That afternoon, my aunt had been seized by a violent headache, the kind that left her prostrate in a darkened room, quite unable to venture out into society. The sensible course of action would have been to stay home. A young unmarried woman simply did not attend balls without a chaperone. It was one of those ironclad rules of propriety that governed our every movement, designed to protect feminine virtue and maintain social order. To violate this rule was to invite scandal, speculation, and social ruin. But as I sat in my aunt's drawing room that evening, already dressed in my best gown, a pale blue silk that was 3 years old but still presentable, something rebellious stirred within me. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this would likely be my last season in London. My father had hinted that he could no longer afford to maintain me in town, that it was time I returned to Somerset and accepted my fate as a spinster daughter. who would care for her aging parents. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, a refusal to let propriety dictate every moment of my existence. Or perhaps it was a last, desperate grasp at something I couldn't quite name, a final act of defiance before I retreated permanently from the world. Whatever the reason, I made my decision. I would attend the ball alone. The carriage ride to the Ashworth residence in Mayfair felt interminable. With each passing street, my courage wavered. What was I doing? This was madness. I would be ruined, gossiped about, cut by respectable society. And for what? An evening of watching others dance and enjoy themselves while I stood alone against the wall? But even as these doubts assailed me, I could not bring myself to turn back. There was something liberating about having already decided to commit social suicide. If I was to be ruined anyway, I might as well do it spectacularly. The Ashworth ballroom was magnificent, a glittering testament to wealth and taste. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across the polished floor, where already dozens of couples were engaged in a lively country dance. The walls were lined with hothouse flowers, their heavy perfume mixing with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive French perfume. The cream of society was present: viscounts and earls, wealthy merchants' daughters hunting for titles, and the inevitable collection of ambitious mothers surveying the room like generals planning military campaigns. I entered alone, giving my name to the butler with what I hoped was confidence, but suspected was merely reckless bravado. And then I stepped into the ballroom, and I felt it immediately: the shift in the atmosphere, the turning of heads, the sudden hush that rippled through nearby conversations. The whispers began almost instantly. I could not hear the exact words, of course. The well-bred did not openly gossip where the subject could hear them clearly, but I caught fragments, words that drifted to me like poisoned arrows. Alone, no chaperone, desperate, shameless. Lady Worthington, a matron known for her strict adherence to propriety, actually turned her back on me, a deliberate cut that was unmistakable in its intent. Several young ladies I had considered acquaintances suddenly found reasons to move to the opposite side of the room. The gentlemen either studiously ignored my presence or regarded me with the sort of speculation that made my skin crawl, for a woman without proper chaperonage was presumed to be without proper virtue. The laughter started then. Not open, mocking laughter. That would have been too crude for such refined company. No, this was worse. These were the barely suppressed giggles behind fans, the knowing looks exchanged between matrons, the smirks of young ladies who saw in my humiliation confirmation of their own superiority. I wanted to flee. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to escape this nightmare before it became worse. But pride, that damnable pride that had always been both my greatest strength and my worst flaw, kept my feet planted firmly on the ballroom floor. I would not run. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I moved to the edge of the room, positioning myself near a cluster of potted palms where I might be less conspicuous. My face felt hot. My hands trembled slightly, and I was grateful for the fan I carried, which gave me something to do with my nervous fingers. I told myself I would stay for exactly 1 hour, long enough to prove I would not be cowed, short enough to limit the damage to my already tattered reputation. It was then that I saw him. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood, Viscount Ashford, stood near the doors leading to the garden terrace, a glass of champagne in his hand, surveying the ballroom with an expression of profound boredom. I knew of him, of course. Everyone knew of him. At 30 years of age, he was one of the most eligible bachelors in England, possessed of an ancient title, a considerable fortune, and the kind of classical good looks that caused young ladies to sigh dramatically and their mothers to scheme tirelessly. But he was also known for his refusal to marry. Despite being hounded by every matchmaking mama in London for the better part of a decade, he had remained stubbornly single. There were rumors, naturally. Some said he had loved and lost tragically in his youth. Others claimed he was too particular, holding out for a perfection that did not exist. Still others whispered that he simply enjoyed his bachelor freedom too much to surrender it for matrimony. I had never been formally introduced to him, moving as we did in vastly different social circles. But I had observed him at various functions, and I had always been struck by a certain quality he possessed, a sense of detachment, as if he were watching the social circus from a great distance, mildly amused but never truly engaged. At that moment, as if feeling my gaze, he looked up. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. I should have looked away. It was improper to stare, especially at a gentleman so far above one's station. But something held me frozen, unable to break the connection. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the channel, seemed to see through all my carefully constructed defenses, straight into the terrified, defiant heart of me. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. And in that moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps, or sympathy from one outsider to another. For despite all his advantages, I suddenly understood that Lord Nathaniel Blackwood was as much a stranger in this glittering world as I was. Then he moved. I watched in disbelief as he set down his champagne glass and began walking across the ballroom. Surely he was not. But yes, he was walking directly toward me. The crowd seemed to part before him like the Red Sea before Moses, conversations dying in his wake as people turned to watch his progress with avid curiosity. He stopped directly in front of me. Up close, he was even more striking. Tall, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, a strong jaw, and those remarkable gray eyes that now regarded me with unmistakable interest. He bowed, a gesture of such perfect courtesy that it made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. And then he extended his hand, and I heard his voice for the first time, deep and cultured with a hint of warmth that contradicted the cool, aristocratic mask. He asked me to dance. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed upon us, hundreds of witnesses to what would undoubtedly become the most discussed moment of the season. The Viscount Ashford, who had refused to dance with the most beautiful, most accomplished, most eligible young ladies of the ton, was asking the ruined, shameless, entirely inappropriate Eleanor Hartley to be his partner. I should have refused. Any rational person would have refused. This could only make the scandal worse, could only draw more unwanted attention to my already precarious position. But as I looked into those gray eyes, I saw something that made my heart skip. Not pity, not contempt, but genuine interest. He wanted to dance with me, not out of charity, not to mock me, but because he had chosen to. And so I placed my trembling hand in his strong, steady one, and I accepted. The orchestra struck up a waltz. The moment his hand settled at my waist, the world narrowed to a point of perfect clarity. I had danced before, of course. Awkward quadrilles with elderly uncles at family gatherings, a handful of forgettable country dances with unremarkable gentlemen who asked out of obligation rather than desire. But this was different. This was a waltz, that scandalous import from the continent that still raised eyebrows among the more conservative members of society. And I was dancing it with a viscount, in front of everyone who had just witnessed my humiliation. As we began to move across the floor, I became acutely aware of several things simultaneously. First, that Lord Nathaniel Blackwood was an exceptional dancer, guiding me through the steps with such ease that even my mediocre skills appeared graceful. Second, that every person in the ballroom was watching us with expressions ranging from shock to envy to barely concealed outrage. And third, most unsettling of all, that he was looking at me, truly looking at me, in a way that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen for the first time in my life. He spoke first, his voice low enough that only I could hear it over the music. He asked me if I made a habit of causing scandals, or if tonight was a special occasion. The unexpectedness of the question, delivered with a hint of amusement rather than censure, startled a laugh from me before I could stop it. I replied that I was merely an amateur in the art of scandal, and that I suspected he had witnessed far more impressive exhibitions during his years in society. A smile touched his lips, not the polite, meaningless expression one offered in social situations, but something genuine and surprisingly warm. He countered that most scandals in the ton were rather predictable affairs involving gambling debts or indiscreet liaisons. A young woman entering a ballroom alone showed considerably more originality. I felt my face flush, though whether from embarrassment or pleasure at his obvious amusement, I could not say. I explained with more honesty than was probably wise that originality had not been my intent. My chaperone had fallen ill, and I had made the foolish decision to attend regardless. I added that I was beginning to suspect it had been a spectacular mistake. He asked me why I had come at all, if I had known the reception I would receive. It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself since the moment I stepped into the ballroom. I considered dissembling, offering some socially acceptable excuse about duty or obligation. But there was something about the directness of his gaze, the genuine curiosity in his question, that invited honesty. I told him the truth, that I was 23, unmarried, and unlikely to remedy that situation. That this would probably be my last season in London before I returned to Somerset to live out my days as the spinster daughter who cared for aging parents. That I had wanted one last evening of watching the glittering circus of the Tun before my exile, and that, when faced with the choice between staying home alone or attending alone, some stubborn part of me had refused to let propriety make the decision. As I spoke, I watched his face, expecting to see pity or condescension. Instead, I saw understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, guiding me through a turn with effortless precision. Then he said something that surprised me more than anything that had happened that evening. He told me he understood the appeal of watching the circus, as he had been doing precisely that for the better part of a decade. He confessed that he found most social events unbearably tedious, the same conversations repeated endlessly, the transparent machinations of matchmaking mothers, the performative nature of it all. He attended out of obligation to his position, but he had never felt truly part of the world he inhabited. The candor of his admission caught me off guard. Viscounts did not confess to feelings of alienation with virtual strangers. They certainly did not compare London society to a circus while waltzing at one of its most prestigious events. I found myself studying him with new eyes, seeing past the polished aristocratic exterior to something more complex beneath. I remarked, with perhaps more boldness than wisdom, that it must be a different experience to watch the circus from a position of power rather than from the margins. That he could leave whenever he wished, marry whomever he chose, and society would bend itself into knots to accommodate him. Whereas I had no such luxury. He acknowledged the truth of my observation with a slight inclination of his head, but then he said something that struck me deeply. He suggested that perhaps the cage was simply larger for him, but it was a cage nonetheless. That the expectations placed upon a viscount were as constraining as those placed upon an unmarried woman, merely in different ways. That he was expected to marry appropriately, produce an heir, manage his estates, vote correctly in Parliament, and live his entire life according to a script written by tradition and duty. His words resonated with something in my own experience. I had never considered that privilege might come with its own form of imprisonment, but as I looked at him, I saw the weariness in his eyes, the weight of expectations that he carried. The waltz was coming to an end, and I felt an absurd pang of disappointment. In the space of a few minutes, this man had spoken to me with more honesty than anyone had in years. He had not treated me as a foolish girl or a social inferior, but as someone whose perspective might actually be worth hearing. But as the final notes faded, he did not release my hand. Instead, he asked if I would do him the honor of the next dance as well. I must have looked as shocked as I felt, because amusement flickered across his face again. He said that he had already caused a scandal by dancing with me once. He might as well be thorough about it. And so we danced again. And then again. Each dance, each turn around the floor, brought new revelations. He asked me about books, and seemed genuinely interested when I admitted to a passion for history and poetry. He mentioned having read Mary Wollstonecraft, and asked my opinion of her arguments. When I answered honestly, expecting censure, he instead engaged me in actual debate, challenging my reasoning while respecting my intelligence. We discussed politics, and I was astonished to find that his views were far more progressive than one would expect from a member of the aristocracy. He spoke of the need for reform, of the injustices of a system that concentrated power and wealth in the hands of so few. He asked my perspective on matters of social policy, with genuine curiosity, as if my opinion as a woman of limited means might provide insight he lacked. Between dances, when we should have separated to allow other partners to claim us, he kept me by his side. He procured refreshments, found us a relatively quiet corner near the terrace doors, and continued our conversation as if we were not providing the evening's entertainment for hundreds of avid gossips. He told me about his travels on the continent before the war, describing places I had only read about in books. He spoke of art and architecture, of ideas and philosophies he had encountered that challenged everything he had been taught to believe about society and hierarchy. In turn, I found myself sharing things I had never told anyone. I spoke of the frustration of being dismissed because of my sex, of having thoughts and opinions that were considered inappropriate for a woman to express. I confessed to the loneliness of never quite fitting into the world I inhabited, of always feeling like I was playing a part in a play whose rules I had never fully understood. And he listened, truly listened, not with the polite half-attention most men offered when forced to converse with women, but with complete focus and engagement. I told him about my love of reading, how I had educated myself through my father's modest library, since no other education was available to me. He asked what I was currently reading, and when I mentioned a rather dry philosophical treatise I had borrowed from my uncle, his eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. He had read the same work, he said, and found it impenetrable in places. We spent nearly 20 minutes debating its merits, and I felt my mind come alive in a way it rarely did in conventional social discourse. He made me laugh, too. He had a dry wit that caught me off guard, making observations about the other guests that were wickedly accurate and absolutely uncharitable. He pointed out Lady Worthington, who had cut me so deliberately earlier, and noted that she maintained her reputation as a defender of virtue, despite having been caught in a compromising position with her husband's steward some years ago. The scandal had been hushed up, naturally, because she had money and connections. He said this without rancor, merely as an observation of hypocrisy, but it made me see the injustice of my own situation more clearly. When he mentioned that young Lord Pemberton, currently dancing with a pretty blonde debutante, had recently lost £3,000 at cards, but was still considered an eligible match, I could not help but note the irony. A man could be financially irresponsible, morally questionable, and intellectually vacant, yet remain respectable, whereas a woman who attended a ball without proper chaperonage was ruined beyond redemption. He agreed with a grimace, acknowledging the fundamental unfairness of the system we inhabited. But then he said something that made my heart skip. He told me that perhaps the system was due for some challenging, and that he had always admired people with the courage to defy unjust conventions. The way he looked at me when he said it made me feel as if he were speaking about more than just social conventions. As if he were speaking about us, about this unlikely connection forming between a viscount and a nobody in full view of society's most censorious observers. As the evening progressed, I became aware of the increasing scandal we were creating. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood was not dancing with anyone else. Every waltz, every quadrille, every country dance. He claimed them all. Mothers who had schemed for years to secure even one dance for their daughters watched in helpless fury. Young ladies who had perfected every accomplishment designed to attract aristocratic husbands stared at us with expressions of disbelief and envy. I knew I should be horrified. I should be thinking of the consequences, of how this would be interpreted, of the damage being done to my already fragile reputation. But I could not bring myself to care. For once in my life, I was the center of attention for something other than my failures and inadequacies. And that attention came from a man who actually seemed to value my mind, my opinions, my unconventional perspectives. During one dance, he asked me why I had never married. The question was bold, perhaps too personal for such a new acquaintance, but by this point, we seemed to have moved beyond conventional social boundaries. I answered with brutal honesty. I told him that men did not marry women without fortune or beauty or connections, that I possessed none of these things, and had compounded my disadvantages by being too opinionated, too bookish, too unwilling to play the games necessary to secure a husband, that I had long ago accepted my fate as a spinster, and that I was not particularly distressed by it. Marriage to most of the men I had encountered would have been a prison of tedium and subjugation. He listened to this speech with an expression I could not quite read. Then, he asked if I truly believed all men were so limited in their vision, if I thought no man existed who might value intelligence and honesty over superficial accomplishments. The intensity of his gaze made my breath catch. I replied carefully that if such men existed, they were rare indeed, and certainly not in the market for wives as inappropriate as myself. He said nothing to this, but something shifted in his expression, a determination that I did not fully understand, but that sent a flutter of something dangerous through my chest. The ball was winding down. The crowd had thinned as guests began to depart. We had been together for nearly 4 hours, an eternity in social terms, and an absolute scandal by any measure. I knew I should leave, should end this before it became even more complicated, but I found myself reluctant to break the spell that had somehow been woven between us. Finally, as the orchestra began to play what was clearly intended as the final dance of the evening, he led me onto the floor one last time. This waltz was different from the others. We spoke less, but the silence between us felt full, rather than empty. His hand at my waist seemed to burn through the fabric of my gown. The way he looked at me made me feel beautiful for the first time in my life, not because I had suddenly become so, but because he saw something in me that others had missed. As the music ended and we came to a stop, he did not immediately release me. Instead, he told me something that would echo in my mind for days to come. He said that he had attended hundreds of balls over the years, had danced with countless partners, and had never once had an evening as interesting as this one. He thanked me for reminding him that conversation could be more than meaningless pleasantries, and that courage came in many forms. Then, with a formal bow that somehow felt like the most intimate gesture I had ever experienced, he escorted me to where my carriage waited. The ride home felt dreamlike, unreal. I could not quite process what had happened. A Viscount had spent an entire evening dancing exclusively with me, talking with me as if my thoughts mattered, treating me as if I were his equal rather than his inferior. It defied all logic, all social convention, all reasonable expectation. I told myself firmly that it meant nothing. It had been an aberration, a moment of kindness from a man who was clearly as bored with society as I was. Tomorrow, everything would return to normal. He would resume his place in the upper echelons of the ton, and I would return to my position at its margins, with only tonight's memory to sustain me through my eventual exile to Somerset. But as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, reliving every moment of our dances, every word of our conversations, I felt something dangerous blooming in my chest. Hope, that most treacherous of emotions, the one I had trained myself to suppress years ago. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that Lord Nathaniel Blackwood had just become the most dangerous man in my world, not because he had deliberately set out to break my heart, but because he had done something far worse. He had shown me what conversation with an equal felt like, what it meant to be truly seen and valued. And now that I knew such a thing was possible, how could I ever be content with less? I woke the morning after the Ashworth ball with a pounding headache and a sense of unreality that refused to dissipate even as I splashed cold water on my face and attempted to restore some order to my appearance. The events of the previous evening felt like a fever dream. Surely I had not spent 4 hours dancing exclusively with Viscount Ashford. Surely we had not conversed with such intimacy and honesty. Surely the entire ballroom had not witnessed what would undoubtedly be interpreted as the most inappropriate display of the season. But the evidence was irrefutable. My feet ached from hours of dancing. My best gown bore the telltale wrinkles of extended wear. And when I descended to the breakfast room, I found my aunt, recovered from her headache, but now afflicted with an entirely different malady, clutching a sheaf of calling cards and invitations with trembling hands. Aunt Pemberton informed me, in tones that wavered between horror and hysteria, that the morning callers had begun arriving at an unconscionably early hour. Word of my scandalous evening had spread through London society with the speed of wildfire. Some of the visitors had come to express their shock and disapproval. Others, more surprisingly, had come to secure invitations for future events, suddenly eager to associate themselves with the woman who had captured the attention of the ton's most elusive bachelor. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. These were the same people who had laughed at me the previous evening, who had cut me and whispered about me, and treated me as if I were beneath their notice. But now that a viscount had shown me favor, I had somehow become interesting, worthy of cultivation. It would have been amusing if it were not so pathetic. I assured my aunt that the entire incident meant nothing, that Lord Nathaniel had simply taken pity on me in my humiliation, that by tomorrow, some new scandal would have erupted and I would be forgotten once again. Even as I spoke these words, I tried to believe them myself. It was safer to assume the worst, to expect nothing, than to allow hope to take root. My aunt seemed dubious, but relieved by my pragmatic attitude. She suggested that I remain at home for a few days, allow the gossip to die down, and then resume my normal activities with suitable contrition and humility. It was sound advice, the sort that any sensible woman would follow. I had every intention of heeding it. Truly I did. But then, 2 hours later, as I sat in my aunt's small morning room attempting to distract myself with needlework, a skill at which I was spectacularly incompetent, our butler announced an unexpected delivery. A book had arrived for me, along with a note. The book was a first edition of a philosophical treatise we had discussed the previous evening, one I had mentioned being unable to find in any of the bookshops I frequented. The note, written in a bold masculine hand, was brief. Lord Nathaniel wrote that he had thought I might enjoy having my own copy, as our debate had reminded him why he had found the work so stimulating upon first reading. He hoped I would accept it as a token of appreciation for the most intellectually engaging evening he had spent in recent memory. I stared at the note for a long moment, my heart performing acrobatics that were entirely inappropriate for an organ meant to simply pump blood. This was not nothing. This was deliberate. A gentleman did not send books to unmarried ladies unless he intended to continue the acquaintance. The gift was surprisingly intimate. He had listened to what I said, remembered it, and taken action based on that knowledge. I told myself firmly that I was reading too much into a simple gesture of courtesy, that men of his class performed such kindnesses routinely, without any deeper significance, that I was being ridiculously foolish to interpret a book as anything more than what it appeared to be. But I could not quite extinguish the small flame of hope that had ignited in my chest. The following morning, I decided to take my usual walk in Hyde Park. It was a ritual I had maintained throughout my seasons in London, a early morning constitutional during the unfashionable hours when the park was relatively empty. I enjoyed the relative solitude, the opportunity to think without the constant pressure of social performance. And after the chaos of the past 2 days, I desperately needed the clarity that walking provided. The morning was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of spring light that made everything seem freshly washed and full of possibility. I walked along the Serpentine, watching the ducks paddle about, and observing the few other early risers who, like me, preferred the park before it became crowded with fashionable society. I had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I saw him. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood was riding a magnificent black horse along the path ahead of me, looking utterly at ease in his riding clothes. For a moment, I considered turning down a side path, avoiding what would surely be an awkward encounter. What did one say to a viscount who had shown one extraordinary attention and then sent one books? How did one behave in such an unprecedented situation? But before I could make my escape, he saw me, his face lit with unmistakable pleasure, and he immediately guided his horse in my direction. There was nothing to do but stand my ground and attempt to appear as if my heart were not racing absurdly. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached me, offering a bow that managed to be both formally correct and somehow warm with genuine friendliness. He remarked on the beauty of the morning and expressed surprise at finding me in the park at such an early hour. I replied, with more composure than I felt, that I often walked in the mornings, as it was the one time of day when the park was relatively peaceful. I thanked him for the book, which I told him was extraordinarily thoughtful. He waved away my thanks, saying it was a small thing. Then he asked if I would mind if he walked with me for a bit, as his horse could use a rest, and he found the exercise beneficial. What could I say but yes? And so we walked together along the Serpentine, his horse's reins held loosely in one hand, and we talked. We discussed the book he had sent, delving into its more complex arguments. He challenged my interpretations, I defended them, and we found ourselves in the sort of vigorous intellectual debate that I had only ever experienced in reading, but never in actual conversation. He asked about my life in Somerset, and I found myself describing my family's modest estate with more honesty than I had intended. I spoke of my father's library, which had been my refuge and my education. I mentioned my older sisters, both respectably married to country gentlemen, and how I had always been the odd one, more interested in books than in domestic accomplishments. He told me about his own estate in Derbyshire, describing it with an affection that surprised me. For someone who seemed so disconnected from society, he clearly loved his land and took his responsibilities as a landowner seriously. He spoke of improvements he had implemented, of his tenants and their welfare, of the satisfaction he found in managing something tangible, rather than simply attending endless social obligations. The conversation flowed so naturally that I lost track of time entirely. It was only when other park visitors began to appear, fashionable ladies taking their morning airings, gentlemen on horseback, nurses with their charges, that I realized we had been walking and talking for over an hour. I remarked that I should return home, as my aunt would be wondering where I had gone. He agreed, but with what seemed like genuine reluctance. He offered to escort me back to my aunt's residence, and I accepted, telling myself that it would be rude to refuse. As we walked through Mayfair's elegant streets, I became aware of the attention we were attracting. People stared, whispered, observed us with expressions ranging from curiosity to censure. A viscount walking with an unmarried woman, unaccompanied by any chaperone, was providing fresh fodder for the gossip mills. When we reached my aunt's house, he handed his horse to a waiting groom and walked me to the door. There, in full view of anyone who happened to be watching, he told me that he had greatly enjoyed our conversation and hoped he might have the pleasure of encountering me again soon. The way he said it made it clear that any future encounters would be as carefully orchestrated as this one had been. Over the following days, these chance meetings became a pattern that even I, with all my determination to be rational, could not dismiss as coincidence. He appeared at Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, just as I was browsing the philosophy section, and we spent an hour discussing recent publications and recommending works to each other. He was at the British Museum when I visited to see the Elgin marbles, and we walked through the galleries together, debating the ethics of removing ancient artifacts from their original locations. He attended a lecture on astronomy at the Royal Society that I had mentioned wanting to hear, and we sat together in the back row, both of us far more interested in our whispered discussion of celestial mechanics than in the lecturer's droning presentation. Each encounter felt natural, effortless, as if we had known each other for years rather than days. We fell into conversations the way other people fell into comfortable chairs, with ease and relief, and the sense of finally being able to relax. He made me laugh with his observations about society's absurdities. He made me think with his probing questions about my beliefs and assumptions, and he made me feel valued in a way I had never experienced before. But with each encounter, my internal conflict intensified. The rational part of my mind, the part that had learned through years of disappointment to protect itself, insisted that I was being absurd. Viscounts did not fall in love with penniless nobodies. Whatever Lord Nathaniel's motives might be, they could not include serious romantic interest. Perhaps he enjoyed our conversations because I was different from the simpering debutantes he usually encountered. Perhaps he found me amusing in the way one might find a clever pet amusing. Perhaps he was simply bored, and I represented a temporary diversion. This rational voice grew louder with each passing day, whispering warnings that I was setting myself up for devastating heartbreak. It reminded me that I had no fortune, no connections, no beauty to recommend me. It pointed out that his family would never accept such an inappropriate match. It insisted that I was being foolish beyond measure, to allow my heart to become entangled with a man so impossibly beyond my reach. But there was another voice, quieter, but increasingly persistent, that whispered different truths. This voice pointed out the way he looked at me when I spoke, as if my words actually mattered. It noted how he sought out my company again and again, going to considerable trouble to manufacture these supposedly coincidental encounters. It reminded me that he had sent me books, engaged me in intellectual debates, treated me as an equal, rather than an inferior. This voice suggested with terrifying hope that perhaps his interest was genuine, that perhaps he saw me not as an amusing diversion, but as someone worth knowing. That perhaps, against all odds and logic, something real was developing between us. I tried desperately to silence this second voice. I told myself I was being ridiculous, allowing romantic fancy to override common sense. I reminded myself of every young woman who had been ruined by allowing herself to believe in the impossible. I lectured myself sternly about the dangers of hope. But hope, I discovered, was remarkably difficult to suppress once it had taken root. The situation became even more complicated when I began to notice changes in how society treated me. Where before I had been invisible or dismissed, I now found myself the object of considerable attention. Invitations that would never have come my way previously began arriving with flattering regularity. Women who had never deigned to speak to me suddenly sought my company, asking transparent questions about Lord Nathaniel and our friendship. Gentlemen who had looked through me as if I did not exist now paused to converse, clearly hoping for introduction to the Viscount through me. The hypocrisy was galling. These people did not care about me as a person. They cared about my sudden proximity to power and influence. I had become interesting, not because I had changed, but because someone important had noticed me. It was a bitter lesson in the arbitrary nature of social value. But amid all this unwanted attention, there was one person whose interest never felt calculated or self-serving. Lord Nathaniel continued to seek out my company, with a consistency that both thrilled and terrified me. He did not seem to care about society's opinion of our friendship. He brushed aside the whispers and speculation with aristocratic indifference, focusing instead on our conversations, our debates, our growing connection. During one of our walks in Hyde Park, these had become a nearly daily occurrence by the end of the second week, he asked me about my plans for the future. What did I want from life? He wondered. If I could have anything I desired. It was a dangerous question, one that required me to articulate dreams I had long ago learned to suppress. I hesitated, unsure how honest I should be, but there was something about the way he asked, with genuine curiosity and without judgment, that made me want to answer truthfully. I told him that what I wanted most was the freedom to think, to learn, to engage with ideas without being constrained by society's narrow definition of appropriate feminine interests. I wanted to matter for something beyond my potential as someone's wife or mother. I wanted to use my mind, to contribute something meaningful to the world, to be valued for my intelligence rather than dismissed because of my sex. As I spoke, I felt vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical exposure. I was revealing the deepest parts of myself to someone who had the power to mock or dismiss them. But when I finished and dared to look at him, I saw not mockery, but something that looked remarkably like understanding. He told me that he had spent most of his adult life feeling similarly constrained, that his title and position came with expectations that felt suffocating, the requirement to marry appropriately, produce an heir, live according to a script written by tradition and duty, that he had often wondered what his life might have been like if he had been born without the burden of aristocratic expectations. We stood there in the middle of Hyde Park, surrounded by the trappings of the very society that constrained us both, and acknowledged a kinship that transcended class and circumstance. We were both prisoners of different kinds, both seeking something authentic in a world built on artifice. It was in that moment, I think, that I truly began to fall in love with him, not because he was handsome or titled or wealthy, those things I could have resisted, but because he saw me, truly saw me, in all my complicated, opinionated, inappropriate glory, and seemed to value exactly what I was. That evening, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of my small bedroom and trying to make sense of my churning emotions. I was falling in love with a man I could not have. Every rational instinct I possessed screamed at me to protect myself, to withdraw before I was hurt beyond recovery. But my heart, that treacherous organ, refused to listen to reason. I told myself that I needed to create distance, to step back from this intensity before it consumed me entirely. I resolved to decline the next invitation I received from him, to break this pattern of daily meetings before it became impossible to extract myself. But even as I made these resolutions, I knew they were lies I was telling myself for comfort. I knew that when I saw him again, and I would see him again, I would be unable to resist. I had tasted something precious and rare, and I could not willingly give it up, even knowing that keeping it might destroy me. I was caught in a trap of my own emotions, loving a man I had no right to love, hoping for a future that seemed impossible, and yet unable to stop myself from wanting it with every fiber of my being. The rational voice in my head kept insisting that this could not end well, that I was being reckless and foolish, that I should protect myself while I still could. But for once in my careful, cautious life, I decided to ignore rationality. Whatever happened, whatever heartbreak awaited me, at least I would have these moments. At least I would have known what it felt like to be truly seen, truly valued, truly cherished by someone extraordinary. Even if it all fell apart, even if society crushed us, even if reality eventually intruded on this magical interlude, I would have these memories. And perhaps, I thought in my most hopeful moments, that would be enough, though I suspected, with growing certainty, that nothing would ever be enough again. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood had ruined me far more effectively than any scandal could have. He had shown me what love could be, and now I would spend the rest of my life measuring everything against this impossible standard. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Ashworth ball, when I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I had accompanied my aunt to Lady Pemberton's weekly tea, one of those interminable gatherings where society's matrons assembled to dissect the latest scandals over delicate china and cucumber sandwiches. Normally, I would have avoided such events with the dedication of someone evading the plague, but my aunt had insisted, claiming that my recent notoriety required careful management. I needed to be seen behaving with perfect propriety, she argued, to counterbalance the irregularity of my friendship with Lord Nathaniel. I had been attempting to make myself invisible in a corner of Lady Pemberton's drawing room, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold while I counted the minutes until we could politely depart. when I heard his name mentioned in a conversation taking place just beyond the partially open door to the adjacent parlor. Lady Worthington's voice, sharp with vindictive pleasure, cut through the murmur of conversation. She was telling someone, I could not see whom, that the entire situation was predictable and rather pathetic. She said that Lord Nathaniel was clearly amusing himself with an unsuitable woman before inevitably making an appropriate match. She added that men of his station often engaged in such dalliances, finding entertainment in the novelty of conversing with women who were too ignorant of social norms to know their place. Another voice, one I did not immediately recognize, suggested that perhaps his intentions were honorable. After all, he had been remarkably consistent in his attentions. Lady Worthington's laugh was like broken glass. She assured her companion that no viscount in possession of his senses would marry a penniless nobody when he could have his pick of the season's most eligible young ladies. She speculated that Miss Hartley, I felt my stomach clench at hearing my name spoken with such contempt, had likely encouraged his attentions through calculated behavior, hoping to trap him into an inappropriate engagement. But men of Lord Nathaniel's intelligence, she insisted, knew how to enjoy a woman's company without committing the folly of matrimony. The conversation continued, but I heard nothing more. A roaring sound had filled my ears, drowning out everything except the pounding of my own heart and the voice in my head that kept repeating, with cruel insistence, "She is right. She is absolutely right." I left Lady Pemberton's house shortly thereafter, claiming a headache that was not entirely fabricated. My aunt, noting my pallor, did not object. During the carriage ride home, I stared unseeing out the window, Lady Worthington's words echoing relentlessly in my mind. I had been a fool. A spectacular, ridiculous fool. What had I been thinking? That a viscount would fall in love with someone like me? That our conversations and walks and shared interests somehow transcended the vast gulf between our positions? That he saw me as a potential wife rather than an amusing diversion? The evidence, when I forced myself to examine it objectively, was damning. He had never once mentioned anything that suggested a future together. He had never spoken of his family or introduced me to them. He had never called upon me formally or sought permission from my father to court me. He had simply been present, talking to me, walking with me, engaging me in conversation. All things he could do without any commitment, without any intention beyond the moment. I had interpreted his attention as romantic interest because I wanted it to be romantic interest. Because for the first time in my life, someone extraordinary had noticed me, and I had been so starved for validation that I had read meaning into gestures that likely meant nothing at all. The realization was devastating, not least because I recognized the truth in Lady Worthington's assessment. I had been naive, allowing myself to believe in a fantasy because the reality of my situation was too painful to accept. I was 23, unmarried, and unlikely to receive any genuine marriage proposals. My brief moment of notoriety would fade. Lord Nathaniel would move on to more appropriate pursuits, and I would return to Somerset to live out my days as the spinster aunt who once had the audacity to believe she could capture a viscount's heart. The humiliation of it was almost unbearable. Not just the private humiliation of my own foolishness, but the public humiliation of knowing that all of society was watching, waiting for the inevitable moment when I would be discarded. They were probably taking bets at the gentlemen's clubs, speculating on how long it would take before the viscount tired of his novelty and returned to his own world. I had become exactly what I had always despised, a pathetic figure of fun, someone to be pitied and mocked in equal measure. That evening, when a note arrived from Lord Nathaniel suggesting we meet at the British Museum the following afternoon to view a new exhibition, I did not respond. For the first time since our acquaintance began, I ignored his invitation. The next morning, when I saw him riding in Hyde Park during my usual walk, I turned down a side path before he could see me. My heart protested violently at this avoidance, but I forced myself to continue walking away. I needed to begin the process of extracting myself from this situation before I was hurt even more deeply than I already was. Over the following days, I perfected the art of avoidance. I declined invitations to events I knew he would attend. I changed the timing of my walks to avoid our usual meeting times. When he sent notes, I responded with brief, formal replies that offered excuses without explanation. I was unwell. I was occupied with family matters. I had prior commitments. All lies, but necessary ones. I told myself I was being sensible, protecting what remained of my dignity. I was cutting my losses before they became insurmountable. I was doing what any rational woman would do when faced with the reality of an impossible situation. But in truth, I was being a coward. I was running away because I could not bear to face the moment when he would inevitably confirm what Lady Worthington had said, that I had been nothing more than an amusing diversion, a brief entertainment before he returned to the serious business of finding an appropriate wife. My aunt noticed my withdrawal and initially seemed relieved. She commented that it was wise to create some distance, to allow the gossip to die down before we returned to Somerset at the end of the season. She did not understand that I was not creating strategic distance. I was fleeing from something that had become too painful to endure. The worst part was how much I missed him. I had known him for only 3 weeks, yet his absence left a void in my daily life that seemed impossible to fill. I missed our conversations, the way he challenged my thinking and made me laugh. I missed the feeling of being truly seen and valued. I missed the hope, foolish though it had been, that perhaps I had found something rare and precious. But missing him did not change the fundamental reality of our situation. He was a viscount with obligations and expectations. I was nobody, with nothing to recommend me. Whatever fantasy I had constructed in my foolish heart, it could never survive contact with reality. A week after I began my campaign of avoidance, my aunt informed me that we had received an invitation to Lady Hartfield's ball. It was one of the last major events of the season, and my aunt was surprised we had been invited at all, given my irregular behavior. She suggested we attend, as it would be an opportunity to demonstrate that I had returned to proper conduct before we departed London. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to decline. Lord Nathaniel would certainly attend. He was connected to the Hartfield family through some complicated aristocratic relationship. Seeing him would be torture, especially now that I had resolved to maintain distance. But pride, that stubborn, destructive pride that had always been both my greatest strength and my worst flaw, would not allow me to hide away completely. If I was to leave London and return to Somerset, if this chapter of my life was to end, then I would end it on my own terms. I would attend the ball, demonstrate that I was perfectly fine, and prove to everyone, including myself, that Lord Nathaniel Blackwood had not broken me. The evening of the Hartfield ball, I dressed with particular care. I chose a gown of deep emerald silk that I had been saving for a special occasion. It was the finest dress I owned, purchased during a brief period when my father had enjoyed unexpected financial success. The color brought out the auburn highlights in my hair and made my skin appear less pale than usual. I would never be beautiful, but on this night, I could at least be presentable. My aunt and I arrived fashionably late, and the ballroom was already crowded with London's elite. I scanned the room carefully, trying to locate Lord Nathaniel so that I could position myself as far from him as possible. But before I could spot him, I saw something that made my carefully constructed composure crack. He was dancing with the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She was tall and elegant, with golden hair arranged in perfect curls and a figure that could only be described as exquisite. Her gown was clearly from one of London's most exclusive modistes, and she wore jewels that suggested considerable wealth. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted her place in society, who had never questioned whether she belonged. I watched them dance, and I felt something inside me crumble. They looked perfect together. He, dark and aristocratic and commanding. She, golden and lovely and utterly appropriate. They moved in perfect synchronization, as if they had danced together hundreds of times before. I turned to the woman standing nearest to me, Lady Pemberton's cousin, whose name I could never remember, and asked with what I hoped was casual interest, who the lady dancing with Lord Nathaniel might be. The woman looked at me with surprise, as if everyone should know the answer. She informed me that the lady was Lady Cordelia Ashworth, Lord Nathaniel's cousin, who had just returned to London after spending several months touring the continent. She added with barely suppressed excitement that Lady Cordelia and Lord Nathaniel had been expected to marry for years, as it would unite 2 branches of the family and consolidate their considerable properties. Of course she was his cousin. Of course there was a perfect, appropriate woman waiting in the wings, someone who belonged in his world in a way I never could. Of course I had been deluding myself. I watched them complete their dance, watched as she laughed at something he said, watched as she touched his arm with the easy familiarity of someone who had known him all her life. and I felt every foolish hope I had been harboring shrivel and die. The whispers started almost immediately. The same society that had gossiped about my inappropriate friendship with the Viscount now gossiped about his reunion with his beautiful cousin. I heard fragments of conversation all around me, people noting how well-suited they were, how Lady Cordelia's fortune and connections made her the ideal choice, how everyone had known that Lord Nathaniel would eventually make the appropriate match. And then someone mentioned me. I could not hear exactly what was said, but I caught my name and saw several women glancing in my direction with expressions of pity. Poor Miss Hartley. She really thought she had a chance. How pathetic to have believed that a Viscount would choose her over someone like Lady Cordelia. I wanted to flee. I wanted to run from the ballroom, from London, from everything that reminded me of my spectacular foolishness. But pride, that damnable pride, kept my feet planted. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I would not confirm their narrative that I was a pathetic figure whose pretensions had been appropriately crushed. I moved to the edge of the ballroom, positioning myself near the terrace doors where I might be less conspicuous. I told myself I would stay for exactly 1 hour, demonstrate that I was perfectly composed, and then leave with my dignity intact. But then Lord Nathaniel saw me. I watched his face change when his eyes found me across the crowded room. He looked surprised, then pleased, then concerned, as if he could read my emotional state from a distance. He said something to Lady Cordelia, who looked in my direction with undisguised curiosity, and then he began moving through the crowd toward me. No, I could not do this. I could not stand there and make polite conversation while my heart shattered into increasingly smaller pieces. I could not pretend that everything was fine when I had just had my worst fears confirmed. I turned toward the terrace doors, intending to escape into the garden where I might compose myself before facing him, but I was not fast enough. His voice came from behind me, saying my name with concern that felt like a knife to my chest. He asked if I was unwell, noting that I had been avoiding him for over a week and that he had been worried. I turned to face him, calling upon every reserve of composure I possessed. I assured him I was perfectly well, simply busy with preparations for my departure from London. I thanked him for his concern, but said it was unnecessary. My tone was cool, formal, nothing like the warmth and openness that had characterized our previous conversations. I saw confusion flicker across his face, followed by something that looked like hurt. He asked if he had done something to offend me. His eyes searched my face, trying to understand the sudden change in my behavior. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. What had he done? He had been kind to me. He had talked to me as if I mattered. He had made me believe, for a brief, shining moment, that I might be worthy of something more than the life that had been prescribed for me. And in doing so, he had made my inevitable return to reality infinitely more painful. But I could not say any of that. Instead, I told him that he had done nothing wrong, that our friendship had been pleasant, but that all things must end, and that I wished him well in his future endeavors. I delivered this speech with admirable calm, considering that internally I was screaming. He looked at me as if I had struck him. He said my name again, this time with something in his voice that I could not quite identify. Confusion, perhaps, or hurt, or frustration. But before he could say more, Lady Cordelia appeared at his side. She slipped her hand through his arm with casual possessiveness and addressed him with the kind of intimate familiarity that spoke of long acquaintance. She suggested that he had promised her another dance, and surely he would not disappoint her. I saw my opportunity and took it. I offered them both a polite curtsy and excused myself, claiming I had promised to speak with someone on the other side of the room. It was a transparent lie, but it allowed me to escape before my carefully maintained composure cracked entirely. I spent the rest of the evening avoiding him with strategic precision. When he moved toward one side of the room, I moved to the other. When he seemed to be searching the crowd for me, I positioned myself behind groups of people or stepped briefly onto the terrace. It was exhausting and undignified, but it was necessary. I could not face him again. I could not maintain my facade of indifference if he looked at me with those gray eyes that saw too much. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I convinced my aunt that I had developed a headache and needed to leave. During the carriage ride home, I stared out the window and allowed the tears I had been suppressing all evening to finally fall. I had been right to build walls, right to protect myself. I had simply built them too late. The damage had already been done. I had fallen in love with someone I could never have, and now I would spend the rest of my life living with the consequences of that foolishness. Tomorrow, I decided, I would begin packing for Somerset. I would leave London and never return. I would take up my prescribed role as the spinster daughter, and try to forget that I had ever been foolish enough to hope for something more. And perhaps, in time, the memory of Lord Nathaniel Blackwood would fade. Perhaps I would stop hearing his voice in my head, or seeing his face in my dreams. Perhaps I would learn to be content with the life I had, rather than mourning the life I had briefly imagined possible. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and feeling the weight of my misery press down upon me, I knew these were more lies I was telling myself for comfort. I would never forget him, never stop loving him, never stop regretting the 3 weeks when I had been foolish enough to believe that someone like him could truly care for someone like me. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that hope was the cruelest emotion, because it forced you to experience the death of possibility. Better never to hope at all than to hope and lose. Better to live within the safe confines of low expectations than to reach for something beautiful and have it slip through your fingers. I had reached for something beautiful, and I had failed. Now I would spend the rest of my life paying the price for that audacity. The days following the Hartfield ball passed in a fog of misery that I attempted, with limited success, to conceal from my aunt. I went through the motions of daily life, rising, dressing, taking meals, engaging in meaningless needlework, but I felt as if I were watching myself from a great distance, a spectator to my own existence rather than an active participant. My aunt, blessedly, seemed to interpret my subdued behavior as appropriate resignation to our impending departure from London. She made arrangements for our journey back to Somerset, sorting through correspondence and settling accounts with the efficiency of someone eager to close a chapter that had proven more complicated than anticipated. She did not ask about Lord Nathaniel, and I was grateful for her discretion, whether it stemmed from tact or simply a desire to avoid uncomfortable conversations. I had resolved not to attend any further social events. There seemed no point in subjecting myself to more public humiliation. I would remain quietly at home until our departure, avoid any possibility of encountering Lord Nathaniel, and begin the process of rebuilding the emotional walls that I should never have allowed to crumble in the first place. But society, as I should have known, had other plans. 3 days after the Hartfield ball, an invitation arrived that even my aunt could not dismiss. Lady Ashworth, the same Lady Ashworth whose ball had initiated this entire catastrophic sequence of events, was hosting an intimate soirée, and she had specifically requested our attendance. The invitation made clear that this was not a large gathering, but rather a select assembly of notable guests, and declining would constitute a deliberate insult that could have repercussions for my family's social standing. My aunt insisted we attend. She argued that we had only a week remaining in London, that one more event would not kill me, and that maintaining cordial relations with families like the Ashworths was important for my sister's futures, even if my own romantic prospects had proven disappointing. I wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at me to stay home, to protect myself from further pain, but I could see the determination in my aunt's face, and I understood her reasoning. My own disappointment should not be allowed to damage my family's connections. And so, with resignation that felt like accepting my own execution, I agreed to attend. The evening of the soirée, I dressed in a gown of dove-gray silk, appropriate for someone in my position, neither too fine nor too shabby, the sort of dress that allowed one to blend into the background. I arranged my hair simply, applied no additional adornments, and examined myself in the mirror with detached assessment. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had accepted her fate and was no longer reaching for impossible dreams. Lady Ashworth's residence in Grosvenor Square was everything one would expect from a family of such prominence: elegant, imposing, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The soirée, as promised, was intimate by ton standards, with perhaps 50 guests assembled in the grand drawing room. A string quartet played softly in one corner, and servants circulated with champagne and delicate canapés. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and positioned myself near a window, hoping to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. My aunt had immediately been drawn into conversation with Lady Pemberton and several other matrons, leaving me blessedly alone to observe the gathering. And then I saw them. Lord Nathaniel stood near the fireplace, deep in conversation with several gentlemen I recognized as members of Parliament. But it was not his presence that made my breath catch and my heart sink. It was hers. Lady Cordelia Ashworth stood at his side, resplendent in a gown of pale gold silk that seemed to capture and reflect every light in the room. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid hours to perfect, with delicate pearls woven throughout. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, not ostentatious, but clearly expensive, the sort of jewels that announced wealth and status without needing to shout. She was, quite simply, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Not just beautiful in feature, though her face was classically lovely with high cheekbones, large blue eyes, and a perfectly shaped mouth, but beautiful in the way she moved, the confidence with which she inhabited her body and her place in society. She belonged here in a way I never could, as naturally as a swan belonged on water. I watched as she laughed at something one of the gentlemen said, the sound musical and perfectly modulated. I watched as she touched Lord Nathaniel's arm, the gesture casual and familiar, speaking of long intimacy. I watched as he looked down at her, and though I could not read his expression from this distance, there was an ease between them that spoke of deep connection. They looked perfect together, like figures in a painting titled The Ideal Aristocratic Couple. He, dark and commanding and intelligent. She, golden and lovely and graceful. They belonged to the same world, spoke the same language, understood the same unspoken rules. They made sense in a way that he and I never had, never could. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my champagne, to breathe through the tightness in my chest. I had known this was coming. Lady Worthington had told me explicitly that Lord Nathaniel would make an appropriate match. Seeing the reality of it should not hurt this much. I had prepared myself for this, but preparation, I was discovering, did nothing to mitigate actual pain. I became aware that someone had approached me. I looked up to find Lady Ashworth herself, her expression one of gracious interest that did not quite reach her eyes. She greeted me warmly, expressing pleasure at my attendance. Then, with the sort of casual cruelty that society matrons had perfected over generations, she suggested that I must meet her niece, Lady Cordelia, who had just returned from the continent. She thought we might have much in common, as we were of similar age. I could hardly refuse without appearing churlish, and so I found myself being led across the room toward the very people I most wanted to avoid, my hostess's hand firm on my elbow, giving me no opportunity to escape. Lord Nathaniel saw us approaching. His eyes met mine, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, pleasure, concern, a complicated mixture of emotions that I could not fully parse. He took a step toward us, but Lady Ashworth reached Lady Cordelia first. The introductions were performed with impeccable courtesy. Lady Cordelia's hand was soft and perfectly manicured when I took it. Her smile was gracious, her greeting appropriately warm, and her eyes, when they met mine, were sharp with assessment and unmistakable triumph. She knew. Of course she knew. The entire ton knew about my inappropriate friendship with her cousin, and she understood, as clearly as I did, that she had won a competition I had never stood a chance of winning. Lady Ashworth, having completed the introduction, excused herself to attend to other guests, leaving the three of us in an awkward tableau. Lord Nathaniel looked as if he wanted to say something, but Lady Cordelia spoke first. She told me, with a smile that showed perfect white teeth, that she had heard so much about me, that everyone had been talking about Nathaniel's charming new friend. She emphasized the word friend just slightly, enough to make its limitations clear. She said she was delighted to finally meet the young woman who had provided her cousin with such entertaining conversation during her absence from London. The words were perfectly polite, but their meaning was unmistakable. She was marking her territory, making clear that whatever connection I had enjoyed with Lord Nathaniel was temporary and inconsequential. She was the one with the prior claim, the deeper connection, the appropriate credentials. I was merely an amusing interlude. I responded with equal politeness, congratulating her on her return from the continent and expressing hope that her travels had been enjoyable. My voice sounded remarkably steady, considering that internally I was fragmenting into increasingly smaller pieces. Lord Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice tight with some emotion I could not identify. He said my name, then stopped, as if uncertain how to continue. Lady Cordelia saved him from his evident discomfort. She slipped her hand through his arm again, that gesture of casual possession that spoke volumes. and reminded him that he had promised to introduce her to Lord Pemberton, who was apparently interested in discussing some political matter. She offered me a smile that did not reach her eyes, and expressed hope that we would have the opportunity to speak again soon. It was a dismissal, politely delivered, but unmistakable. I was being removed from the conversation, relegated to my proper place on the periphery. Lord Nathaniel looked at me as if he wanted to protest, but Lady Cordelia was already guiding him away. I watched them go, her golden head tilted up toward his darker one, her hand proprietarily on his arm, and I felt something inside me break cleanly in two. I needed to leave, immediately. I could not stay in this room, watching them together, enduring the pitying or triumphant glances of other guests who had witnessed that painful exchange. But I could not simply flee. That would create exactly the sort of scene I was desperate to avoid. And so I did what any well-bred woman would do in such circumstances. I sought refuge in the ladies' retiring room. The small chamber set aside for feminine repairs was blessedly empty. I sank onto a velvet settee and pressed my hands to my face, breathing deeply, trying to regain some measure of composure. I would not cry. I absolutely would not cry. Not here, where someone might enter and find me in distress. Not over a man who had never actually promised me anything, who had simply been kind when I had foolishly interpreted that kindness as something more. But even as I gave myself this stern lecture, tears began to leak from my eyes. I pressed my hands harder against my face, as if I could physically prevent the emotion from escaping. I had been right all along. Every warning I had given myself, every caution I had tried to heed, had been correct. I was not appropriate for someone like Lord Nathaniel. Lady Cordelia was appropriate, beautiful, wealthy, well-connected, comfortable in the world he inhabited. She belonged at his side in a way I never could. The cruelest part was that I could not even dislike her. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been born into the right family, with the right advantages, and she carried those advantages with natural grace. It was not her fault that I had been foolish enough to love a man so far beyond my reach. The door opened, and I quickly wiped my eyes, attempting to compose myself, but it was not another guest entering. It was Lady Cordelia herself. She paused when she saw me, her perfect features arranging themselves into an expression of concerned sympathy that somehow managed to be deeply patronizing. She asked if I was quite well. Her tone suggested she knew perfectly well that I was not. I assured her I was fine, merely fatigued from the late hours society kept. I stood, intending to leave, but she positioned herself between me and the door. What she said next was delivered in a voice so soft and sweet that anyone overhearing would have thought she was offering comfort rather than delivering a killing blow. She told me that she understood how easy it was to misinterpret Nathaniel's kindness, that he had always been thoughtful toward those less fortunate, and that his natural compassion sometimes gave people the wrong impression. She said this gently, as if sharing a confidence, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. She continued, saying that she hoped I understood that Nathaniel's family had certain expectations, that as a viscount, he had responsibilities that transcended personal preference, that while he might enjoy interesting conversations with unusual people, when it came time to marry, he would need to choose someone who could fulfill the obligations of his position. She assured me that she bore me no ill will, that she actually found it rather charming that I had been so hopeful. But she thought it would be kinder, in the long run, to be frank with me. Nathaniel would marry her. It had been understood between their families for years, and while he might have enjoyed my company briefly, I should not mistake temporary amusement for genuine attachment. She delivered this entire speech with a smile, as if she were doing me a tremendous favor by being so honest, and perhaps, in some twisted way, she was. She was confirming everything I already knew, everything I had tried to tell myself, everything I had attempted to protect my heart against. I found my voice, though it felt like speaking through broken glass. I thanked her for her candor, and assured her that she had misunderstood the situation. I told her that Lord Nathaniel and I had enjoyed some interesting conversations, nothing more, and that I harbored no inappropriate expectations. I congratulated her on her impending betrothal, and expressed hope that they would be very happy together. Every word was a lie, but they were necessary lies. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing how thoroughly she had devastated me. Something flickered in her eyes, disappointment perhaps, that I had not broken down or provided her with a more entertaining scene. But she maintained her gracious facade, expressing relief that we understood each other, and hoping that I would not be too disappointed to return to Somerset. Then, with a final smile that did not reach her eyes, she glided past me and out of the room, leaving me alone with the ruins of my foolish dreams. I remained in the retiring room for another 10 minutes, composing myself with ruthless determination. I dried my eyes, pinched my cheeks to restore some color, and examined my reflection in the mirror. I looked pale and strained, but not actively weeping. It would have to be sufficient. When I emerged, I sought out my aunt immediately and informed her that I was unwell and needed to leave. She took one look at my face and agreed without argument. Within 15 minutes, we were in our carriage, departing from Grosvenor Square. I spent the ride home staring out the window at the dark streets of London, Lady Cordelia's words echoing in my mind with devastating clarity. She had been right about everything. I had misinterpreted kindness as romantic interest. I had allowed myself to believe in a fantasy that could never survive contact with reality. I had been, in every sense of the word, a fool. The next morning, I informed my aunt that I wished to leave London immediately. I could not bear to remain for the final week of the season. I gave no explanation beyond a vague reference to missing my family, and my aunt, perhaps sensing that pressing for details would be unwise, agreed to expedite our departure. We left London 3 days later. As our carriage rolled through the city streets for the last time, I did not look back. There was nothing behind me but memories of my own foolishness, and I had no desire to revisit them. I told myself that leaving was a relief, that I was glad to escape the artificial world of the ton and return to the honest simplicity of country life, that I would forget Lord Nathaniel Blackwood and his inappropriate kindness and move forward with the life that had always been meant for me. But even as I constructed these comforting narratives, I knew they were lies. I would not forget him. I would not stop loving him. And I would never, ever forgive myself for being foolish enough to hope that someone like me could be enough for someone like him. The truth, which I could finally acknowledge in the privacy of my own mind as London disappeared behind us, was that Lady Cordelia had not told me anything I did not already know. She had simply forced me to confront what I had been desperately trying to deny. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood belonged to a world I could never enter, and I belonged to a world he would never choose. The brief, shining moment when those worlds had seemed to intersect had been an illusion, a temporary aberration that was always destined to end. Now it had ended, and I was left with nothing but the painful knowledge of what I had lost, or more accurately, what I had never truly had at all. I had been back in Somerset for exactly 4 days when the letter arrived. 4 days of trying to settle back into the rhythm of country life, of pretending that nothing significant had happened in London, of attempting to convince my parents that my early return was merely a matter of fatigue rather than heartbreak. 4 days of staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, replaying every conversation with Lord Nathaniel, and torturing myself with the question of how I could have been so spectacularly foolish. The letter came in the Morning Post, delivered by our elderly butler with the sort of careful neutrality that suggested he recognized the seal and understood its significance. It was addressed to me in a bold, masculine hand that I recognized instantly, and the wax bore the imprint of the Ashford crest. My hands trembled as I took it to my room and stared at it for a full 5 minutes before finding the courage to break the seal. Part of me wanted to throw it in the fire unread, to deny him even this final communication, but a stronger part, the part that had fallen hopelessly in love despite every effort to protect myself, needed to know what he had written. The letter was not long, but every word felt like a blade between my ribs. He wrote that he had been searching for me since the Ashworth soirée, only to discover that I had left London without a word of goodbye. He said he was confused by my sudden departure, by my continued avoidance of him, by the wall I had constructed between us without explanation. He asked what he had done to offend me, what had changed, why I had withdrawn so completely after weeks of what he had believed to be genuine friendship. He wrote that he valued our conversations more than any he had experienced in recent memory, that I had challenged his thinking, broadened his perspective, and made him question assumptions he had held for years, that he had thought, he had hoped, that I felt the same connection he did. He asked me to write back, to explain, to give him some understanding of what had gone wrong. The letter was signed simply, Nathaniel, without his title, as if we were equals rather than occupants of vastly different social spheres. I read it 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. The terrible thing was that I could hear his voice in every line, could picture his expression, could feel the genuine confusion and hurt that motivated his words. And part of me, that foolish, hopeful part that refused to be completely extinguished, wanted to respond, wanted to explain everything, to tell him about Lady Worthington's conversation and Lady Cordelia's warnings, and my own terrified realization that I had fallen in love with someone I could never have. But what purpose would such honesty serve? It would only create more pain for both of us. Better to make a clean break, to allow him to return to his appropriate life with his appropriate future wife, and to spare us both the agony of prolonging the inevitable. And so I did something I had never done before. I ignored a direct communication from someone who deserved better. I placed the letter in the drawer of my writing desk, unopened after that first reading, and I did not respond. Over the following week, 2 more letters arrived. I did not open them. I could not bear to read more words of confusion and hurt, could not allow myself to be drawn back into the fantasy that had nearly destroyed me. Each letter went into the drawer, and each time I felt a piece of my heart calcify a little more. On the 10th day after my return to Somerset, my father called me into his study. He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for a man who had faced down angry tenants and unreasonable creditors with equanimity. He told me that he had received a visitor that morning. Lord Nathaniel Blackwood had arrived at our modest estate, requesting permission to speak with me. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of my father's desk, trying to process what he had just said. Lord Nathaniel was here, in Somerset, at my family's estate. It was impossible, unprecedented, completely inappropriate. I asked my father, my voice barely above a whisper, what he had said to him. My father looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, part concern, part confusion, and perhaps a hint of hope. He said that he had told Lord Nathaniel that he could not grant such permission without first speaking to me, that the Viscount was currently waiting in our drawing room, and that my father would defer to my wishes regarding whether or not to receive him. Every rational part of my being screamed at me to refuse, to send him away, to maintain the walls I had so carefully constructed, to protect myself from more pain. Seeing him again would only make everything worse. It would reopen wounds that were just beginning to scar over, but I could not do it. Despite everything, despite all my resolutions and self-protection and bitter acceptance of reality, I could not send him away without at least understanding why he had come. What could possibly have motivated him to travel all the way to Somerset? What could he want to say that could not be communicated in a letter? I told my father I would see him, briefly, in the drawing room, with the door open, as propriety demanded. My father nodded, relief crossing his features. He left to inform our guest, and I took a moment to compose myself, to smooth my simple muslin day dress, to tuck a stray curl behind my ear. I looked nothing like the ladies he was accustomed to. No elaborate coiffure, no fashionable gown, no jewels or artifice. Just Eleanor Hartley in her natural, unremarkable state. Perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps it would remind him why this entire situation was impossible. I entered the drawing room to find him standing by the window, looking out over our modest gardens. He turned when he heard me, and the expression on his face made my carefully maintained composure waver. He looked exhausted, as if he had not slept properly in days. His usual impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled, his cravat not quite perfectly tied, shadows under those gray eyes that had haunted my dreams. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. The silence stretched between us, full of everything we had not said, everything that remained unresolved. He spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. He asked me why I had been avoiding him, why I had left London without a word, why I had ignored his letters. I forced myself to maintain distance, to keep my voice cool and composed. I told him that I thought it best to end our acquaintance before it became more complicated, that we had enjoyed some interesting conversations, but that ultimately we lived in different worlds, with different expectations, that continuing our friendship would only lead to more gossip and speculation that would be harmful to both of us. He listened to this speech with an expression that grew increasingly frustrated. When I finished, he took a step toward me, then stopped, as if remembering the propriety that required distance. He told me that he did not care about gossip or speculation, that he had spent his entire life living according to other people's expectations, and he was tired of it. He said that our conversations had been the most genuine interactions he had experienced in years, and that I had made him question everything he had previously accepted about his life and his future. I felt my resolve wavering. I wanted desperately to believe him, to accept his words at face value. But Lady Cordelia's warnings echoed in my mind, along with Lady Worthington's cruel assessment. He might believe what he was saying now, but eventually reality would intrude. Eventually his family would demand that he marry appropriately. Eventually he would realize that choosing me would mean social exile, family disapproval, and a lifetime of defending an inappropriate choice. I told him, as gently as I could, that what he was feeling was not worth the cost he would pay, that I had met Lady Cordelia, and she was everything a viscountess should be, that he deserved someone who belonged in his world, who understood its rules and could navigate its complexities, that I was not that person, and pretending otherwise would only lead to misery for both of us. His expression changed, hardening into something that looked like anger. He asked me if I truly believed he was so shallow, so bound by convention, that he would choose a wife based purely on social appropriateness, rather than genuine connection. I replied that I believed he was a good man who would eventually do his duty, as all good men in his position did, that there was no shame in that, and that he should not feel guilty for making the choice that was best for his family and his position. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw frustration, hurt, and something that looked like determination cross his face. Then he asked me a question that cut through all my careful defenses. He asked me if I loved him. The directness of it stole my breath. I had been prepared for many things, but not for this. Not for him to strip away all pretense and demand the raw truth. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to lie, to deny it, to protect myself from the vulnerability of confession. But I had never been good at lying, and I found I could not start now. Not with him. Not about this. I told him yes. Yes, I loved him, which was precisely why I needed to let him go, because loving someone meant wanting what was best for them, even if it broke your own heart. And what was best for him was a life that I could never be part of, a future with someone appropriate, a choice that would not alienate his family or damage his position. He took another step toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart stutter. Triumph, relief, and a determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. He told me that he loved me too, that he had never felt for anyone what he felt for me, that conversations with me had shown him what his life had been missing: genuine connection, intellectual engagement, the ability to be completely honest without performance or pretense. He said that he had been planning to propose to me at the Hartfield ball, before Lady Cordelia's unexpected arrival had complicated everything. I felt tears gathering in my eyes, but I forced them back. This only made everything more painful. If he loved me, if he truly meant what he was saying, then the choice before us was even more cruel, because love was not enough. Love could not overcome the vast social chasm between us, could not make his family accept me, could not prevent the lifetime of struggle that would follow if he made such an inappropriate match. I told him all of this. I explained about Lady Worthington's conversation, about Lady Cordelia's warning, about my realization that hoping for more was not just foolish but actively harmful to both of us. I begged him to be sensible, to think about what he would be giving up, to consider the reality of our situation, rather than the romantic fantasy we had briefly inhabited. He listened to everything I said, and then, instead of agreeing or arguing, he asked me one more question. He asked me if I trusted him. It was such a simple question, but it struck at the heart of everything. Did I trust him? Did I trust that his feelings were genuine and lasting? Did I trust that he understood the consequences of his choice and was willing to accept them? Did I trust that he valued me enough to weather the storms that would inevitably come? I wanted to say yes. Every fiber of my being wanted to say yes. But fear, that paralyzing protective fear that had governed so much of my life, held me back. Before I could answer, before I could find the words to express the complicated tangle of hope and terror inside me, he did something completely unexpected. He told me that there was something I needed to know, something that might change my understanding of the situation. And then he explained that Lady Cordelia had come to London not because she expected to marry him, but because she was running away from a scandal in Paris. That she had fallen in love with an entirely inappropriate French artist and was using the supposed understanding between their families as cover while she negotiated with her parents for permission to follow her heart. He said that there had never been any real understanding between him and Cordelia beyond childhood friendship, that she had allowed society to believe otherwise because it served her purposes, providing her with protection while she fought her own battles, and that she had deliberately misled me at the Ashworth soiree, not because she wanted him for herself, but because she was protecting her own secret and believed that discouraging me would simplify matters. I stared at him, trying to process this revelation. Everything Lady Cordelia had said, all her warnings and subtle cruelties, had been based on deception. She had not been marking her territory or warning off a rival. She had been manipulating me to serve her own agenda. I should have been angry. I should have felt betrayed. But all I felt was a desperate, terrifying resurgence of hope. Lord Nathaniel took my hands in his. His touch was warm, solid, real. He told me that he understood my fear, that he knew the choice he was making came with consequences. But he said that he had spent 30 years living according to expectations, and he had been miserable. That meeting me had shown him what life could be if he had the courage to choose authenticity over propriety. He said that he was going to return to London, that he was going to formally end any speculation about him and Cordelia, that he was going to make clear to his family and to society that he intended to marry me, if I would have him, and that he wanted to know, needed to know, if I loved him enough to accept the difficulties that would come with such a choice. I looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had seen me so completely from the beginning, and I felt my carefully constructed walls crumble. I was terrified. I was doubtful. I had no idea how this could possibly work out well, but I also knew, with sudden clarity, that I would regret refusing him for the rest of my life. I told him, yes, I would marry him. Yes, I loved him enough to face whatever came. Yes, I trusted him, and us, and the connection we had found against all odds and logic. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night, and when he kissed me, gently, reverently, as if I were something precious beyond measure, I felt something inside me heal that I had not even realized was broken. But even as I kissed him back, even as I allowed myself to feel the joy and relief of his declaration, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings. Love was not enough. Society was cruel. His family would object. The path ahead would be difficult in ways I could not yet imagine. I silenced that voice firmly. I had spent too long being ruled by fear and caution. I had built walls to protect myself and ended up imprisoned within them. Nathaniel was offering me a chance at something real, something precious, something worth fighting for, and I was going to take it. Whatever came next, scandal, social ostracism, family disapproval, years of struggle, we would face it together. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough. The journey back to London was unlike anything I had experienced in my carefully ordered life. Nathaniel, I had finally allowed myself to think of him by his given name, without the formal distance of his title, traveled in our modest carriage alongside my aunt and me, having left his own conveyance and horses at a nearby inn. My aunt's expression throughout the journey oscillated between scandalized disapproval and cautious hope, as if she could not quite decide whether my betrothal to a viscount was a triumph or a disaster waiting to unfold. I understood her ambivalence perfectly. I felt it myself, a constant war between joy and terror that left me exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. During the journey, Nathaniel spoke with remarkable candor about what awaited us in London. He did not attempt to minimize the challenges or paint a falsely optimistic picture of our future. His family, he explained, would be shocked and likely hostile. The Dowager Viscountess, his mother, had very specific ideas about appropriate matches, and I fulfilled none of her criteria. His younger sister would probably be more accepting, but she was recently married and living in Scotland, removed from the immediate conflict. Various aunts, uncles, and cousins would have opinions, most of them unfavorable. Society would be even less kind. We would be gossiped about relentlessly. Invitations would be withdrawn. Former friends might cut us in the street. Matrons who had courted his favor for years would turn vindictive, and their daughters, disappointed in their matrimonial ambitions, would say cruel things about me that would be repeated in drawing rooms across London. He told me all of this with brutal honesty, watching my face carefully, giving me every opportunity to change my mind. But he also told me something else. He said that he had spent 3 decades living according to other people's expectations, and he had been profoundly unhappy, that our conversations had shown him what life could be if he chose authenticity over obligation, that he would rather face society's censure with me than live a life of comfortable misery without me. I listened to all of this, feeling my resolve strengthen rather than weaken. I had spent my entire life on the margins of society, never quite fitting in, never quite measuring up to its arbitrary standards. I had nothing to lose by defying those standards now, and perhaps I thought with growing conviction, the life I could build with Nathaniel, difficult as it might be, would be infinitely more valuable than the safe, small existence I had been resigned to accepting. We arrived in London on a grey afternoon, the city shrouded in its typical pall of coal smoke and fog. Nathaniel saw us safely to my aunt's residence, then departed to face his family. We agreed to meet the following day, after he had informed them of his intentions and weathered the initial storm of their reaction. That evening was interminable. I could not eat, could barely sleep, and spent most of the night imagining worst-case scenarios. What if his family's opposition was so fierce that he reconsidered? What if the reality of defying them proved more daunting than he had anticipated? What if I woke to find a letter explaining that he had made a terrible mistake? But the morning brought Nathaniel himself, arriving at my aunt's house with dark circles under his eyes, but unwavering determination in his expression. His family, he reported, had reacted exactly as predicted. His mother had been horrified, declaring that such a match would ruin the family's reputation and demanding that he reconsider. She had questioned my motives, suggested I had somehow entrapped him, and threatened to withhold her approval entirely. Various other relatives had expressed shock, disapproval, and concern for his judgment, but he had held firm. He had explained that his decision was final, that he was not seeking their permission, but merely informing them of his choice. He had made clear that he would proceed with or without their blessing, though he hoped they would eventually come to accept what could not be changed. The toll this confrontation had taken was evident in his exhausted appearance, but his resolve remained unshaken. He told me that we needed to act quickly, to present society with an established fact, rather than giving his family time to orchestrate opposition. He wanted to announce our engagement immediately and marry within the month. The speed was dizzying, but I understood his reasoning. A long engagement would give his family time to work against us, to find ways to separate us, to apply pressure that might eventually crack even the strongest determination. Better to move forward decisively, to commit ourselves irrevocably before opposition could solidify. And so 3 days later, the announcement appeared in the morning papers. Viscount Ashford, to wed Miss Eleanor Hartley of Somerset. The brevity of the notice belied the explosion of reaction it provoked. The gossip was immediate and vicious. I heard reports of it from my aunt, who seemed simultaneously proud of her connection to a viscountess-to-be and mortified by the scandal we were creating. The ton was in an uproar. How had this nobody captured one of London's most eligible bachelors? What hold did she have over him? Was there some secret, some scandal, that had forced his hand? Surely he would come to his senses before the wedding actually took place. The speculation ranged from merely insulting to outright cruel. Some suggested I had trapped him through improper behavior. Others claimed I must be with child, forcing an honorable man into an inappropriate match. Still others insisted that I must have some secret knowledge or blackmail material that gave me power over him. None of these narratives allowed for the possibility that he might simply love me. That seemed to be beyond the collective imagination of society. The invitations that had briefly flowed my way after the Ashworth ball now dried up completely. Former acquaintances crossed the street to avoid acknowledging me. Lady Worthington, encountered by chance at a bookshop, cut me with deliberate cruelty, turning her back and walking away as if I did not exist. Even more painful were the few people who had been genuinely kind to me. Some of them, I learned, were being pressured by their families to distance themselves from the scandal. A young woman I had considered a friend sent a brief note expressing regret, but explaining that her mother forbade further association. The rejection stung, though I tried to understand that these people were as trapped by social expectations as I had been. Through all of this, Nathaniel remained steadfast. He accompanied me to the few events we still attended, his hand firm at my back, his presence a declaration that he stood by his choice. When people whispered, he ignored them. When former friends cut us, he appeared unconcerned. When his mother refused to meet with me, He calmly informed her that she was welcome at our wedding, but that her attendance was not required. His unwavering support gave me strength I had not known I possessed. When doubt crept in during the dark hours of the night, and it did frequently, I reminded myself that he had chosen me knowing the cost, that he was paying that cost daily, with every invitation withdrawn, every relationship strained, every disapproving glance from his family. And yet he never wavered, never suggested that perhaps we should reconsider, never made me feel that I was somehow to blame for the difficulties we faced. 2 weeks before our scheduled wedding, his mother finally agreed to meet with me. I dressed with particular care for the encounter, choosing a modest gown in a subdued color, arranging my hair simply, wearing no jewelry beyond a small cameo that had belonged to my grandmother. I wanted to appear respectable, unthreatening, not the scheming fortune hunter she undoubtedly believed me to be. The Dowager Viscountess received me in her Mayfair townhouse, a grand establishment that made my family's modest Somerset estate look like a cottage by comparison. She was an imposing woman in her 50s, handsome rather than beautiful, with Nathaniel's gray eyes and an expression of aristocratic hauteur that could have frozen the Thames in midsummer. She did not offer me tea. She did not invite me to sit. She simply looked at me with cold assessment and asked what I wanted from her son. I could have dissembled. I could have offered pretty lies about love and devotion that might have softened her opposition. But I had learned, through my relationship with Nathaniel, the value of honest communication. And so I told her the truth. I said that I loved her son, that I had not sought his attention or schemed to capture his interest, that I had, in fact, tried desperately to discourage his pursuit because I understood how inappropriate I was by society's standards, but that he had persisted, that he had chosen me despite all the obstacles, and that I believed we could make each other happy in ways that a conventional match never could. I told her that I understood her concerns, that I knew I lacked the fortune, the connections, the training that she had envisioned for her son's wife, that I would make mistakes, that I would probably never be the Viscountess she had hoped for. But I promised her that I would devote myself to making Nathaniel happy, to being a true partner to him, and to honoring the position I was accepting even if I did not fill it in the way she had imagined. She listened to this speech with an expression that revealed nothing. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, studying me with those penetrating gray eyes that were so like her son's. Finally, she spoke. She told me that she had spent weeks hoping that Nathaniel would come to his senses, that he would recognize this infatuation for what it was and return to his proper obligations. But she had realized, watching him these past days, that this was not a passing fancy, that he was genuinely committed to me in a way she had never seen him committed to anything before. She said that she did not understand his choice, that she likely never would, but that she loved her son, and she could see that he was happier now, despite all the social chaos, than he had been in years. And if I was the source of that happiness, then she would learn to accept it, even if she could not embrace it. It was not a warm welcome. It was not approval or blessing, but it was acceptance, grudging and conditional though it might be, and it was more than I had dared hope for. I thanked her with genuine gratitude. I did not expect us to become close. We were too different, and the circumstances of our relationship too fraught. But perhaps in time, we could achieve mutual respect, if not affection. As I left her townhouse, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We would still face enormous challenges. Society would not magically forgive our transgression of its rules. Life as Viscountess Ashford would be difficult in ways I was only beginning to understand. But we had survived the initial storm, and we were still standing. The wedding took place 4 weeks after our engagement was announced, in a small chapel in Mayfair, rather than the grand society affair that a viscount's marriage would typically warrant. The guest list was limited. My family, a handful of Nathaniel's relatives who had decided to attend despite their reservations, and a few friends brave enough to defy social convention. Notably absent were most of London's aristocratic families, the matrons who had gossiped about us so viciously, and several of Nathaniel's own cousins, who had declared the match so inappropriate as to be unworthy of recognition. Their absence was conspicuous, a public statement of disapproval that would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. But as I walked down the aisle of that small chapel, my hand on my father's arm, and saw Nathaniel waiting for me at the altar, with an expression of such profound joy and relief that it took my breath away, I found that I did not care about the empty pews or the society that had rejected us. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. The words we spoke, the traditional vows of marriage, felt more significant than any elaborate declaration could have been. We were promising to stand together against a world that did not approve, to build a life based on genuine partnership rather than social convenience, to choose each other every day, despite the cost. When Nathaniel kissed me as my husband for the first time, sealing our union before God and the few witnesses who had chosen to support us, I felt something profound settle in my chest. This was real. We had done it. Against all odds, against all rational advice, against the opposition of family and society, we had chosen each other. The wedding breakfast was held at Nathaniel's townhouse. Our townhouse now, I reminded myself with a thrill of disbelief. It was a modest affair by aristocratic standards, but it felt perfect to me. My parents, still somewhat bewildered by their youngest daughter's extraordinary match, mingled awkwardly with what remained of Nathaniel's family. His mother attended but remained distant, her acceptance still too new and fragile to manifest as warmth. But she was there, which was something. Lady Cordelia also attended, having returned to London with her French artist in tow, and her own scandal now brewing. She sought me out during the breakfast and offered what seemed like genuine congratulations. She apologized for her deception at the Ashworth soiree, explaining that she had been frightened and desperate and had used me as a convenient scapegoat. She said she hoped I could forgive her, and that she admired my courage in defying convention to follow my heart, something she understood better than most. I accepted her apology, though I could not quite forget the pain her words had caused. But I was learning that holding grudges required energy I preferred to spend on building my new life. And perhaps, I thought, we were more alike than I had realized. Two women trying to claim happiness in a world that wanted to dictate our choices. As the afternoon wore on, and our modest celebration continued, I found myself standing at a window overlooking the garden, watching Nathaniel converse with my father. They were discussing something agricultural, crops or livestock or improvements to the Somerset estate, and I felt my heart swell with affection for this man who had turned my carefully ordered world completely upside down. He caught me watching and excused himself from my father, crossing the room to stand beside me. He asked me if I was happy. The question was simple, but I heard the underlying concern. Was I regretting my choice now that the reality of it was upon us? Was the price we were paying too high? I told him the truth. I was terrified. I had no idea how to be a viscountess, how to manage a household of this size, how to navigate the social complexities of my new position. I knew that the difficulties we had faced so far were likely only the beginning, that we would spend years, perhaps the rest of our lives, dealing with the consequences of our unconventional match. But I was also happier than I had ever been, because I had found something I had not known existed, a partnership based on genuine connection, respect, and love, a relationship where I could be fully myself, without pretense or performance, a man who valued my mind as much as any other quality, who sought my opinion, who treated me as an equal rather than an ornament or a duty. I told him that I would rather face a lifetime of social disapproval with him than live one more day in the safe, small world I had inhabited before meeting him. The smile he gave me was worth every sacrifice, every difficulty, every moment of fear and doubt. He took my hand and told me that we would figure it out together, that we would make mistakes and face challenges and undoubtedly cause more scandals, but that we would do it as partners, and that made all the difference. The months that followed our wedding were, as predicted, difficult. Society did not suddenly forgive our transgression. Many doors remained closed to us. Some of Nathaniel's family never fully accepted me. There were uncomfortable dinners and awkward social situations and moments when I felt completely inadequate to the role I had assumed. But there were also unexpected joys. The tenants on Nathaniel's Derbyshire estate, less concerned with aristocratic propriety than with the character of their landlord's wife, accepted me with surprising warmth. I discovered that I had a talent for estate management, that my years of watching my father struggle with limited resources had taught me skills that proved valuable on a larger scale. Nathaniel and I worked together to implement improvements, to address grievances, to create a community that functioned better for everyone involved. We also found allies in unexpected places, other couples who had made unconventional matches, people who valued authenticity over appearance, individuals who were tired of society's rigid constraints. We built a new social circle, smaller than what Nathaniel had known before, but infinitely more genuine. His mother gradually, grudgingly, came to accept our marriage. She never quite approved, but she stopped actively opposing us. And when, 2 years after our wedding, I gave birth to a son, an heir to continue the Ashford line, she softened further. She would never be the warm, affectionate mother-in-law of sentimental fiction, but she became someone I could respect, and occasionally, unexpectedly, rely upon. As I sat in the nursery of our Derbyshire estate, 3 years after that scandalous wedding, watching my son sleep, while my hand rested on my swollen belly where his sister grew, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from the humiliated woman entering a ballroom alone, to the frightened girl building walls against heartbreak, to the wife and mother I had become. Society had eventually tired of our scandal, moving on to newer outrages. Some doors had reopened, others remained permanently closed. We would never be the darlings of the ton, would never be fully forgiven for our defiance of convention. But we had built something better than social approval. We had built a life of genuine happiness, partnership, and love. Nathaniel entered the nursery quietly, not wanting to wake our son. He came to stand beside me, his hand joining mine on my belly, feeling the flutter of movement within. He asked me, as he often did, if I had any regrets, if I ever wished I had made different choices. I looked up at him, this man who had seen me when I was invisible, who had valued me when I felt worthless, who had chosen me against all logic and reason, and I told him the absolute truth. The only thing I regretted was all the time I had wasted building walls instead of opening doors, all the energy I had spent protecting myself from possibility instead of embracing it, all the years I had accepted society's assessment of my worth instead of defining it for myself. Meeting him, loving him, choosing him, these were not mistakes or regrets. They were the best decisions I had ever made. They had cost us both dearly, but they had given us something priceless in return. A life built on truth rather than pretense, on partnership rather than obligation, on love rather than convenience. The path we had chosen was not easy. It would likely never be easy. But it was ours, chosen consciously and deliberately, and that made all the difference. As I sat there in the gathering twilight, my husband beside me and my children asleep and growing within me, I thought about that terrified young woman who had walked into a ballroom alone, expecting nothing but more humiliation. I wished I could tell her what awaited her, not to spare her the fear and pain, because those were necessary parts of the journey, but simply to assure her that courage, however imperfect and frightened, was always rewarded. The ton had laughed when I entered the ball alone. They had sneered when the Viscount danced only with me. They had condemned us when we chose each other despite their disapproval. But we had the last laugh, because while they remained trapped in their gilded cages, performing their prescribed roles and living their prescribed lives, we had found something infinitely more valuable than their approval. We had found freedom, and love, and each other, and that, I had learned, was worth everything.